When people think they understand sister wives, they usually think of what they've seen on screen. The conversations, the conflicts, the emotional moments that are carefully captured and edited into a storyline. But what if the version you've been watching for years is only a fraction of the full reality? What if the real story, the emotional truth of living inside a polygamist family system, has never truly been shown in its entirety? Because behind every camera angle, there are moments that don't make the final cut. Behind every episode, there are conversations that never air. And behind every public narrative, there is a private life that exists completely outside of it. For Mykelti Brown, growing up inside this world meant living in a reality that was constantly being observed, but never fully understood. From the outside, viewers see a structured family system, multiple households, shared parenting, interconnected relationships. But from the inside, that structure feels very different. It is not just a concept, it is a lived experience. And lived experiences are always more complex than what can be shown in edited footage. When you grow up in a family dynamic like this, your understanding of normal is shaped differently. Not in a right or wrong way, just in a different way. Because instead of one household rhythm, there are multiple. Instead of one consistent environment, there are variations depending on where you are at any given moment. And as a child, you adapt to that. You learn how to read the room. You learn how to shift between emotional environments. You learn how to understand subtle differences in tone, energy, and expectations. Over time, that adaptability becomes second nature. But what viewers rarely consider is what that adaptation feels like internally. Because adapting constantly is not just a behavioral skill, it is an emotional process, one that requires awareness, observation, and interpretation at a very young age. In the world of sister wives, the adults are often the focus. Their relationships, their decisions, their disagreements. But the children are living inside the consequences of those dynamics, not as observers, but as participants in a system they did not choose. For Mykelti, that meant forming her identity within a structure that was already established long before she fully understood it. And identity formation in that kind of environment is rarely straightforward, because identity is not built in isolation. It is shaped through interaction, through relationships, through emotional feedback, and through the way the environment responds to you as you grow. In a large, interconnected family system, those responses can vary. Sometimes they are consistent, sometimes they are not. Sometimes they feel stable, sometimes they feel shifting, and a child learns to interpret all of it, even when they don't fully have the language for it yet. This is where perception begins to form, not just perception of others, but perception of self. Because when you are growing up in an environment that is being documented, another layer is added. Awareness of being seen, awareness of being watched, awareness that moments of your life are not only experienced internally, but also externally interpreted. For a child, that awareness does not always come all at once. It develops over time, slowly, subtly, until eventually it becomes part of how reality is processed. And that changes how behavior develops, not necessarily in dramatic ways, but in small internal adjustments. How you speak, how you react, how you understand emotional situations. For Mykelti Brown, this environment meant learning to navigate both family dynamics and public perception at the same time. Even when she was not directly thinking about the cameras, their presence still formed part of the background of life. Because when something is always there, it becomes normalized. And when something is normalized, it becomes part of the emotional landscape. But normalization does not mean it has no impact. It simply means the impact becomes integrated. Another layer to understand is that what viewers see is curated, not in a manipulative sense, but in a structural sense. Television requires editing. It requires selecting moments. It requires shaping time into a narrative. And narrative always simplifies complexity. It organizes it. It frames it. It gives it structure. But human experience does not naturally exist in that structure. Real life is continuous, unedited, nonlinear, filled with small moments that never get recorded but still matter deeply to the people living them. This is where the gap between perception and reality begins to form. Viewers form opinions based on what is shown, but those living the experience are responding to everything, including what is not shown. For Mykelti, that difference is significant, because her understanding of her own life includes layers that the audience will never fully see, moments of connection that never air, private conversations that never reach the screen, emotional experiences that exist outside the storyline. And those unseen elements shape her reality just as much, if not more, than what is publicly broadcast. Another important aspect of growing up in this environment is the development of emotional interpretation. Because when you are part of a complex family system, you learn to interpret emotions early, not just your own, but others as well. You begin to notice patterns, shifts in tone, changes in behavior, and over time, this becomes intuitive. For Mykelti, this likely influenced how she understands relationships, how she processes communication, how she interprets emotional situations, because early environments often create long-term frameworks for understanding human behavior. But what makes the situation even more unique is that those frameworks developed in a public context,
which means interpretation was not only internal, it was also externalized through audience perception. People watching the family form their own interpretations of those same dynamics, sometimes aligning with reality, sometimes not, but always adding another layer of narrative on top of lived experience. And that creates a dual existence, one internal, one external, one experienced, one interpreted. As this story continues, what becomes clear is that the version of sister wives seen on television is only one dimension of a much larger reality. And to understand what it is really like inside that world, you have to move beyond the edited narrative, beyond the structured episodes, and into the lived experience of the people who grew up inside it, because that is where the real story begins. The experience of growing up inside the world of sister wives doesn't end with understanding that life is being filmed. It becomes something deeper over time, something internal, something that quietly shapes how reality is understood. For Mykelti Brown, childhood wasn't just about living in a large interconnected family system, it was about learning how to exist within multiple emotional environments at once. Because in a family structure influenced by plural marriage, there isn't just one household rhythm, there are several, each with its own tone, its own patterns, its own emotional atmosphere. And moving between those environments creates a kind of constant adjustment that most people never have to experience. As a child, you don't consciously analyze it. You adapt, you observe, you respond. You learn what feels stable in one place might feel different in another. And over time, that adaptability becomes second nature. But what is rarely understood from the outside is how that kind of adaptability shapes identity development. Because identity isn't formed in isolation, it is formed through repetition, stability, and emotional feedback. When those elements are consistent, identity feels grounded. When they vary, identity becomes more flexible, but also more complex. For Mykelti, that complexity meant learning how to understand herself in relation to different environments, different relationships, different expectations. And in a system like Sister Wives, those expectations are not always uniform. They shift depending on context, depending on household, depending on timing. And a child learns to navigate that shifting structure without always having the tools to fully articulate what they are experiencing. Another important layer is emotional perception, because in large family systems, especially those that are publicly documented, emotional awareness develops early. Children begin to notice patterns that adults may not explicitly explain. They sense tension, they recognize connection, they interpret change, even when nothing is directly said. And that kind of awareness becomes part of how reality is processed. For Mykelti Brown, this likely meant developing a heightened sensitivity to relational dynamics, not in a dramatic sense, but in a perceptive one. Understanding shifts in energy, recognizing differences in interaction styles, observing how relationships function within a larger system. And over time, those observations become internal frameworks that influence how she understands relationships later in life. Another key aspect of this environment is divided attention, because in a large family, attention is naturally distributed across multiple relationships, not because of lack of care, but because of structure. There are many children, many responsibilities, many emotional needs happening simultaneously. And from a child's perspective, that distribution can feel different at different times, sometimes stable, sometimes variable, sometimes predictable, sometimes less so. And children interpret those patterns in deeply personal ways. They begin to understand where they fit, how they are seen, when they are prioritized, and those interpretations often shape emotional development. For Mykelti, growing up in this environment meant forming her own understanding of belonging, not in a simple sense, but in a layered one, because belonging in a complex family system is not always about presence alone. It is about emotional connection, consistency, recognition, and those elements can vary in any household structure. Another important psychological concept here is normalization, because when you grow up in a specific environment, that environment becomes your baseline. What feels normal to you may feel unfamiliar to others, and what feels unusual to outsiders may feel completely ordinary from within. For Mykelti Brown, this means her understanding of family life was shaped by what she experienced firsthand, not by outside comparison, not by external standards, but by lived reality. And that reality includes complexity, variation, and emotional nuance. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is how children in visible families develop self-awareness earlier than most, because even if they are not actively thinking about being filmed, they grow up with the awareness that their lives are part of a larger narrative, a story that others are watching, interpreting, discussing, and that awareness becomes part of identity formation, not in a conscious way at first, but gradually, as understanding deepens over time. For Mykelti, this likely meant learning to balance internal experience with external perception, understanding that how she felt inside was not always identical to how things were interpreted outside. And that distinction becomes important later in life, because it teaches separation between self and narrative. Another key element of this environment is emotional translation, because in a system like Sister Wives, experiences are often interpreted in multiple ways at once, within the family and by the audience, and those interpretations are not always aligned, which means a single moment can carry different meanings depending on perception. For Mykelti, this creates a unique awareness of how situations can be understood differently depending on context, and that awareness can influence communication, reflection, and emotional processing. Another important factor is adaptation over time, because childhood experiences don't remain static, they evolve. As understanding grows, as perspective develops, as identity forms more clearly, and what once felt normal may later be seen differently with maturity. For Mykelti, this means her early experiences are not frozen in time, they are part of a continuing interpretation of her own life, and that interpretation continues to evolve as she grows.
For Mykelti Brown, growing up inside the world of Sister Wives meant that ideas about trust, love, and relationships were formed in a very unusual environment. Not unstable in the dramatic sense people often assume from watching reality TV, but complex, layered, and constantly evolving. Because when your family structure is built around multiple households and multiple emotional connections, your understanding of relationships doesn't come from a single example. It comes from many. And each example carries its own emotional tone, its own rhythm, its own way of handling connection. And over time, those patterns become internalized, not as rules, but as impressions. For Mykelti, this likely meant that relationships were never understood in a simple or linear way. Instead, they were seen as dynamic systems, shaped by communication, timing, emotional effort, and individual personality differences. And that kind of exposure creates a broader understanding of human connection, but it also adds complexity to how trust is formed. Because trust is not just about one consistent experience. It is built through repetition, predictability, emotional safety. And when those elements vary across environments, trust becomes something that is learned gradually, through observation, through experience, through time. Another important psychological layer here is attachment, because early relationships with caregivers shape how people expect emotional connections to function later in life, not in a fixed way, but in a foundational one. For Mykelti Brown, growing up with multiple parental figures and multiple household dynamics likely created a broader emotional framework, one where connection could exist in different forms, not just one model, but several. And that can create flexibility in understanding relationships, but it can also require deeper reflection later in life about what feels stable and meaningful personally. Another key factor is emotional observation, because children in complex family environments often become highly observant without realizing it. They notice patterns in communication, they pick up on changes in tone, they recognize shifts in emotional energy between people, even when nothing is explicitly explained. And this kind of awareness becomes a long-term skill. For Mykelti, this likely influenced how she reads relationships today, how she interprets behavior, how she understands emotional dynamics, because early observation becomes internal processing later in life. Another layer to consider is how love is understood in a system like Sister Wives, because love is not experienced in only one format. It exists across multiple relationships, multiple households, multiple expressions, and that exposure can shape a more expansive understanding of emotional connection, but it can also create questions about consistency, about emotional focus, about where individual connection fits within a larger structure. For Mykelti, this likely meant forming her own definition of what meaningful connection looks like, not based on one model, but based on many, and over time, refining that understanding into something personal. Another important psychological concept is emotional independence, because as children grow in complex environments, they often learn to process emotions internally before expressing them externally, not because they are taught to suppress feelings, but because they are learning how to navigate multiple emotional contexts, and that can create a strong sense of internal processing ability. For Mykelti Brown, this may have contributed to a deeper ability to reflect on relationships rather than react immediately to them. Another factor is expectation formation, because when someone grows up in a dynamic environment, they learn early that relationships are not always predictable. They shift, they evolve, they respond to circumstances, and that understanding becomes part of how future relationships are approached. More awareness, more flexibility, less assumption that things will always look the same. Another key element is communication style development, because children often mirror how communication happens around them. They learn when to speak, when to listen, how emotions are expressed within the family system, and those learned behaviors often carry into adulthood. For Mykelti, this likely influenced how she communicates in relationships today, possibly making her more aware of emotional tone, more attentive to dynamics, more conscious of timing and context. Another layer is emotional resilience, because navigating complex family relationships requires adaptation, understanding differences, processing change, and continuing forward even when dynamics evolve. And that resilience becomes part of personality. For Mykelti, it likely plays a role in how she handles challenges in her adult life, not by avoiding difficulty, but by working through it with perspective. Another important point is that childhood experiences don't define outcomes. They influence them, they shape perspective, but they do not determine identity completely, because people continue to grow, continue to interpret their experiences, continue to redefine their understanding of relationships over time. For Mykelti Brown, life inside Sister Wives wasn't just about family structure or emotional dynamics. It was also about visibility, constant visibility. Because unlike most people who grow up learning who they are in private, she grew up in a world where many of her life moments were being recorded, edited, and broadcast to an audience. And that changes something fundamental in how identity develops. At first, when you're young, cameras don't feel like a barrier. They feel like part of the environment, just another object in the room, something normal, something you adapt to without thinking too much about it. But as awareness grows, something shifts internally. You start to realize that moments of your life are not just happening, they are being seen, and more importantly, they are being interpreted. For a child or teenager, that realization introduces a new layer of self-awareness, because now behavior is not only about how you feel internally, but also about how it might be perceived externally. And that awareness, even if subtle, influences how identity forms over time.
For Mykelti, growing up in this environment meant learning to balance two versions of reality, the lived experience and the recorded experience, the private emotional truth and the public narrative, and those two things don't always move in perfect alignment. Another important psychological factor is self-perception under observation. When people know they are being watched, even indirectly, they often adjust how they present themselves, not in a fake way, but in a naturally adaptive way. Tone may shift slightly, awareness increases, emotional expression may become more measured in certain moments, and over time, those small adjustments can become part of personality expression, not because someone is acting differently, but because awareness itself changes behavior. For Mykelti, this meant growing up with a level of self-awareness that most people don't develop until much later in life, understanding that moments can be seen, discussed, interpreted, and remembered by an audience who only sees fragments of the full story. Another layer to this experience is privacy loss, because privacy isn't just about secrets or hidden information. It's about having space to grow without external interpretation, and when parts of your life are public, that space becomes smaller, not completely gone, but reduced. And that reduction changes how reflection happens, because private experiences often serve as the foundation for identity development. They allow people to make mistakes, process emotions, understand themselves without outside influence. For Mykelti, some of those spaces existed, but others were shared with the public, and that creates a unique balance between openness and protection. Another key concept here is identity fragmentation. When someone's life is both private and public, identity can sometimes feel split into layers. There is the internal self, the family self, the public self, and all of these versions interact with each other. Sometimes they align, sometimes they feel slightly different depending on context. And part of growing up in that environment is learning how to integrate those layers into one stable sense of self. Another important aspect is audience interpretation, because once a moment is broadcast, it is no longer owned solely by the people living it. It becomes something shared, something discussed, something analyzed. And that means the meaning of a moment can expand beyond its original context. For viewers of Sister Wives, this creates a version of the story that is shaped not only by what is shown, but also by how it is understood. And those interpretations can vary widely. Some viewers see one thing, others see something completely different, and both interpretations can exist at the same time. For Mykelti, this means her lived experience is often surrounded by multiple external narratives, some accurate, some incomplete, all shaped by perspective. Another layer to this is emotional self-regulation, because growing up in a public environment often requires learning how to process emotions while being aware of visibility, not suppressing emotions, but understanding when and how they are expressed, and that skill becomes part of emotional development. Another important factor is long-term identity formation, because childhood visibility does not disappear in adulthood. It becomes part of how someone understands themselves over time, not as a limitation, but as a context. For Mykelti Brown, this means her identity has been shaped both by lived experience and public observation, and balancing those two influences is part of her ongoing growth.
For Mykelti Brown, one of the most complex and emotionally layered relationships in her life has been with her father, Kody Brown, as seen through the world of Sister Wives. But what viewers see on television is only a surface version of something that exists on a much deeper emotional level. Because father-child relationships are never just about presence. They are about consistency, connection, communication, and emotional reliability over time. In a traditional setting, a child usually experiences one household structure with one primary routine. But in this family system, things are more complex. Time is divided, attention is shared, and emotional availability is spread across multiple relationships. And for a child growing up in that environment, it shapes expectations in subtle but important ways. For Mykelti, this likely meant learning early that connection with her father was not always constant in the same way it might be in other family structures. Not because of lack of care, but because of structure, and structure influences experience. Over time, children begin to form their own understanding of what a relationship means based on what they experience repeatedly, not what they are told, but what they observe. And those observations become internal frameworks for emotional understanding. Another key psychological layer here is perceived emotional availability. Because what matters most in childhood relationships is not only physical presence, but emotional presence. Does the child feel seen? Does the interaction feel meaningful? Is there a sense of connection in the moment? And when those feelings vary, the child adapts emotionally. They adjust expectations. They interpret experiences in a way that helps them make sense of the relationship. For Mykelti Brown, this likely meant forming her own interpretation of her relationship with Kody Brown over time, not based on one moment, but based on many moments accumulated across years. Another important concept is emotional comparison. Because in a large family system like sister wives, children naturally become aware of differences, not necessarily in a judgmental way, but in an observational way. They notice how relationships function differently across households, how interactions may vary depending on context, and those observations shape understanding of what connection looks like. For Mykelti, this likely contributed to a broader awareness of relationship dynamics in general, not a single definition of normal, but multiple examples of connection existing in different forms. Another layer to this is emotional independence, because when children grow up in environments where parental attention is divided, they often develop internal processing skills earlier. They learn to reflect, to understand emotionally internally, to make sense of experiences without always relying on external validation, and that becomes a long-term emotional strength. For Mykelti Brown, this may have influenced how she navigates relationships as an adult, not expecting uniform emotional patterns, but understanding that relationships evolve over time. Another important factor is role awareness, because in large family systems, children often become aware of their place within the structure, not in a rigid sense, but in a relational sense. They understand how they connect to different members of the family, and how those relationships differ in tone and expression. For Mykelti, this awareness likely shaped how she understood her connection with her father compared to other relationships in her life. Another psychological concept here is meaning-making, because people naturally assign meaning to relationships based on experience. A child may interpret moments differently than an adult would, and as they grow, those interpretations evolve. For Mykelti, her understanding of her relationship with Kody has likely developed over time as she gained more perspective and emotional maturity. What may have felt one way at a younger age may be understood differently now, and that evolution is part of growth. Another layer to this dynamic is communication structure, because in complex family systems, communication does not always happen in a straightforward way. It can be influenced by timing, context, family dynamics, and emotional state, and children learn to navigate those patterns as they grow. Another important factor is emotional memory, because relationships are shaped not only by present interactions, but also by accumulated emotional experiences over time, and those memories influence how current interactions are interpreted. For Mykelti, this means her relationship with Kody Brown is shaped by both past and present experiences combined, not isolated moments, but a long-term emotional timeline. For Mykelti Brown, the relationship with her mother, Kody Brown, represents a very different emotional foundation compared to other dynamics within the world of sister wives. Because while the broader family structure was complex, shifting, and multi-layered, a mother-child bond often carries a more direct emotional consistency, and that consistency becomes extremely important in environments where many things are constantly changing. Kody's role in Mykelti's life wasn't just about parenting in the traditional sense. It was also about emotional grounding, providing stability, offering understanding during moments of uncertainty, and creating a space where identity could be expressed more freely. For a child growing up in a large, interconnected family system, that kind of emotional grounding becomes a reference point, a place where feelings are processed, where experiences are understood, where personal identity can take shape without confusion. For Mykelti, this likely meant that her connection with her mother helps balance the complexity of the larger family structure. Because while the system around her included multiple relationships, multiple households, and multiple emotional dynamics, her relationship with Kody provided a more consistent emotional anchor. Another important psychological layer here is emotional validation, because one of the most important aspects of a parent-child relationship is being able to express feelings and have them acknowledged, not necessarily agreed with or resolved immediately, but understood. And that kind of validation helps a child develop emotional confidence, the ability to trust their own feelings, to express themselves clearly, to understand their internal world. For Mykelti, this likely played a significant role in shaping how she communicates and processes emotions today. Another key concept is identity reinforcement, because children form their sense of self partly through how they are seen by their parents. When a parent recognizes individuality, supports expression, and encourages independence, it strengthens identity formation. For Mykelti, this may have contributed to her ability to define herself outside of the broader family structure, not just as a member of a system, but as an individual with her own thoughts, choices, and direction. Another important aspect is emotional safety, because emotional safety allows a child to explore identity without fear of rejection or misunderstanding. It creates space for growth, for experimentation, for self-discovery, and that kind of environment becomes essential during development. Within the world of sister wives, where many dynamics are public and complex, having a space that feels emotionally safe becomes even more important. For Mykelti, Kody likely provided that space in many ways throughout her upbringing. Another layer to this relationship is communication style, because children often learn how to communicate by observing their parents' tone, expression, response patterns, and over time, those communication patterns become internalized. For Mykelti Brown, this may have influenced how she approaches conversations, emotional expression, and interpersonal relationships today. Another key psychological factor is resilience modeling, because children also learn how to respond to challenges by observing how their parents handle difficulty, how they adapt, how they move forward, and how they maintain emotional balance during change. Kody's experiences within the family system likely provided Mykelti with a model of resilience and adaptation, not in a theoretical sense, but in a lived, observable way.
Another important element is individuality within family structure, because even in a large family system, each parent-child relationship is unique. It develops its own rhythm, its own emotional language, its own form of connection. For Mykelti, her relationship with Christine likely developed a strong sense of individuality and emotional closeness that differs from other relationships in the family. Another layer to this dynamic is emotional continuity, because while other aspects of life may shift, households, relationships, circumstances, the bond with a primary caregiver often provides continuity over time, and that continuity helps anchor identity during periods of change. For Mykelti, this likely played an important role in maintaining a sense of stability as she grew up. Another psychological concept is emotional reflection, because children often learn how to understand themselves through how they are understood by their parents. When emotions are reflected back clearly and consistently, it becomes easier to process them internally, and that leads to stronger emotional awareness in adulthood. For Mykelti, this may have contributed to her ability to reflect on relationships and experiences with clarity. Another important aspect is transition over time, because parent-child relationships are not static. They evolve, from dependency in childhood, to understanding in adolescence, to mutual respect in adulthood. And for Mykelti, this evolution is part of her ongoing story.
At some point in every person's life, especially someone raised inside a highly structured and visible environment like sister wives, there comes a shift. A moment where the focus slowly moves from family system to personal identity. For Mykelti Brown, this transition wasn't dramatic in a single instant. It happened gradually, through choices, through experiences, through distance, emotional and physical, from the environment she grew up in. And that process is one of the most important stages in understanding her story. Because stepping out of a complex family structure is not just about leaving a physical space. It is about redefining identity. It is about separating who I was within the system from who I am becoming outside of it. And that separation takes time. Another key psychological concept here is individuation, the process of becoming a fully independent self, not defined only by family roles, not shaped only by early environment, but developed through personal decision-making and lived experience. For Mykelti, individuation likely meant asking deeper questions about her life, what she values, what she wants, what kind of relationships feel right for her, and what kind of future she wants to build independently. This stage is especially important for individuals who grow up in environments where identity is closely connected to a larger family structure. Because in those systems, it can be easy, especially in childhood, to be seen as part of a collective identity, rather than as a fully separate individual. But adulthood changes that dynamic. It creates space for self-definition, and that space can be both freeing and challenging. Freeing because it allows autonomy, challenging because it requires responsibility for choices without relying on the structure of the past. For Mykelti Brown, this likely meant navigating both freedom and uncertainty at the same time. Another important factor is identity reconstruction, because once someone steps outside their original environment, they begin to reinterpret their experiences, not rejecting them, but reevaluating them, understanding what those experiences meant, how they shaped them, and how they can be integrated into a new version of self. For Mykelti, this means her childhood inside Sister Wives is not something she leaves behind emotionally. It becomes part of her story, but it no longer defines her entire identity. Another key layer is decision-making autonomy, because building an independent life means making choices without the immediate influence of the family system. Choices about relationships, about lifestyle, about direction, and each decision becomes part of identity formation. For Mykelti, this transition includes defining her own relationships and life priorities in ways that reflect her personal values rather than inherited structure. Another psychological concept involved here is boundary creation, because independence requires establishing emotional and relational boundaries, understanding where personal space begins, where external influence ends, and how to maintain balance between connection and individuality. And in families that are closely connected and publicly known, boundary setting becomes even more important. Another aspect of this transition is emotional recalibration, because when someone steps into independence, they often begin to see their past differently, with more clarity, more distance, more understanding, not necessarily changing what happened, but changing how it is interpreted. For Mykelti, this means viewing her upbringing through a more balanced lens, recognizing both the strengths and the complexities of growing up in a large public family system. Another key element is relationship evolution, because as identity changes, relationships also shift. Some become closer, some become more defined, some become more independent in structure, and that is a natural part of growing up. For Mykelti,
This means her relationships with family members continue to evolve as she defines her own adult identity. Another important factor is self-trust, because independence requires trusting your own judgment, your own decisions, your own emotional understanding, and that trust is built over time through experience, not instantly. For Mykelti, this likely developed gradually as she navigated life outside the immediate structure she grew up in. Another psychological layer is narrative ownership, because once someone steps into adulthood, they begin to take ownership of their own story, not just as it is told by others, but as it is lived internally. And for someone who grew up in a public environment like sister wives, that ownership becomes especially meaningful, because it allows personal identity to exist beyond public interpretation. Even after stepping into adulthood and creating her own path, Mykelti Brown remains connected to the world of sister wives in a way that many people never fully leave behind. Because when your childhood is part of a long-running reality series, public attention doesn't simply disappear when you grow up. It changes shape. It becomes quieter in some ways, more selective in others, but still present in the background of life. And learning how to navigate that balance becomes part of identity itself. For Mykelti, this means living in two spaces at once. One is private life, relationships, personal decisions, family experiences that belong to her. The other is public perception, how people interpret her life based on what they see, hear, or assume from the show's history. And those two spaces don't always align perfectly. Another important psychological concept here is perceived visibility. Even when someone is not actively filming or publicly sharing every moment, there is still an awareness that parts of their lives are known to others. That awareness can subtly influence how a person chooses to share information, what they express, what they hold back, and what they keep completely private. For Mykelti Brown, this likely means developing a strong sense of intentional sharing, deciding what parts of her life feel appropriate to make public, and what parts are meant to stay within personal boundaries. Another key factor is narrative control, because one of the biggest differences between childhood and adulthood in a public-facing family is control over personal storytelling. As a child, your story is shaped by editing, production, and external framing. As an adult, you gain more ability to define your own narrative, to speak for yourself, to clarify misunderstandings, to present your experiences in your own voice. For Mykelti, this shift represents empowerment, because it allows her to participate in how her life is understood, rather than only being represented by others. Another important aspect is audience interpretation, because once someone has been part of a public story for years, viewers often form long-term impressions. They associate personality traits, they build narratives around past events, and those interpretations can persist even as the person grows and changes. For Mykelti, this means that public perception may sometimes lag behind her actual personal development. People may still view her through older moments of the show, rather than her current reality, and that creates a gap between who she is and how she is perceived. Another psychological concept involved is emotional boundary maintenance, because maintaining a healthy sense of self in a public environment requires separating personal emotional life from external commentary, not ignoring feedback completely, but filtering it, understanding what is meaningful and what is simply projection from outside observers. For Mykelti Brown, this likely becomes an important skill in maintaining emotional stability. Another layer to this experience is selective sharing, because in the age of social media, public figures are not just seen, they are followed in real time, and that creates both connection and pressure. Sharing becomes intentional rather than automatic, moments are chosen carefully, and privacy becomes something actively protected rather than passively assumed. Another key element is identity stability, because when someone grows up in the public eye, their identity is often discussed by others before it is fully formed internally, and as they grow older, part of their development involves separating internal identity from external labeling. For Mykelti, this means continuously reinforcing her own understanding of who she is, independent of public narrative. Another important factor is emotional autonomy, because managing public attention requires the ability to regulate emotional responses to external opinions, not letting outside perspectives fully shape self-worth or personal direction, and that autonomy strengthens over time through experience. Another psychological layer is integration, because adulthood in a public family system is not about disconnecting from the past, it is about integrating it into a fuller identity, understanding where you came from, what shaped you, and how those experiences contribute to who you are now. For Mykelti, this means her past on Sister Wives is not something separate from her identity. It is part of it, but not the entirety of it.
Once a life has been shared through a long-running series like Sister Wives, it doesn't remain just a personal story anymore. It becomes a public narrative. And for Mykelti Brown, that means her journey is not only experienced by her, it is also interpreted by millions of viewers who have followed her family for years. But interpretation is never neutral. People don't just watch events, they analyze them. They compare them. They assign meaning based on their own experiences, beliefs, and emotional reactions.
And that creates multiple versions of the same story existing at once. Another key psychological concept here is narrative framing, because audiences naturally organize what they see into a storyline. They connect past moments to present developments. They look for patterns. They look for growth. They look for conflict, resolution, and transformation. And once a narrative frame is formed, it becomes the lens through which everything new is interpreted. For Mykelti, this means her life is often viewed not just as individual moments, but as part of a larger ongoing arc within Sister Wives. Another important factor is emotional projection, because viewers don't just observe reality TV, they emotionally engage with it. They relate it to their own experiences, their own families, their own beliefs about relationships and identity. And that emotional connection can shape how they interpret Mykelti's decisions and growth. Some may see independence, some may see conflict, some may see continuation of family patterns, and all of these interpretations can exist simultaneously. Another layer is selective perception, because people tend to notice details that confirm what they already believe. If someone views the family system one way, they will interpret new information through that same lens, and that can lead to very different understandings of the same events. For Mykelti Brown, this means her actions can be seen in multiple ways depending on the viewer's perspective, and none of those perspectives fully capture the entire reality. Another psychological element is distance between lived experience and observed experience, because viewers only see edited portions of life. They see selected conversations, edited timelines, structured storytelling, but they do not see the full context behind every moment. They do not see private conversations, emotional processing that happens off camera, or the everyday reality that exists outside of filming. For Mykelti, this creates a gap between how she experiences her life and how others understand it. Another important concept is identity externalization, because when someone is part of a public story, their identity is often discussed as if it is fixed, defined by past moments, defined by television history. But in reality, identity is constantly evolving. People grow, they change, they develop new perspectives over time, and that evolution is often slower to be recognized by the public than it is experienced internally. For Mykelti, this means her current self may not always align with older perceptions of her. Another key factor is emotional investment from audiences, because long-term viewers of Sister Wives often feel a sense of connection to the family. They've watched years of growth, conflict, and change, and that emotional investment leads to strong opinions about outcomes, about relationships, about individual choices, and that investment can influence how Mykelti's story is received. Another layer is storytelling bias, because in any long-form narrative, people naturally emphasize certain parts of the story while minimizing others. They focus on dramatic moments, turning points, emotional highlights, but real life is not built only from highlights. It is built from everyday moments that rarely get shown. For Mykelti Brown, this means the public version of her life is always incomplete. Not inaccurate, but incomplete. Another psychological idea is reinterpretation over time, because audiences also change. As they rewatch or reflect on past seasons, their understanding of events can shift. They may see things differently with new information or maturity, and that changes how the story is collectively understood. When you look at the full journey of Mykelti Brown inside the world of Sister Wives, it becomes clear that this is not just a story about reality TV, and it is not just a story about a well-known family. It is a story about identity under pressure, identity in transition, an identity that continues to evolve even after the cameras stop focusing on childhood. Because what makes her experience unique is not just the structure she grew up in, but the way she has moved through it over time. Growing up in a large, interconnected family system means learning early that life is not simple or linear. It is layered. It is relational. It is shaped by multiple perspectives at once. And for Mykelti, this meant developing an understanding of life that includes complexity as a normal part of existence, not as something unusual, but as something expected. Another key idea in her journey is transformation over labeling, because when people grow up in public-facing environments, they are often labeled early by viewers, defined by certain moments, certain storylines, certain interpretations. But real identity is not fixed to one moment in time. It evolves, it shifts, it expands. And for Mykelti Brown, her life reflects that evolution clearly. The child seen in early episodes is not the same person navigating adulthood today, not because she became someone different, but because she became more fully herself over time. Another important psychological layer is integration, because growing up in a system like Sister Wives means carrying many different experiences at once: family connection, public visibility, emotional complexity, personal growth. And part of adulthood is learning how to integrate all of those experiences into one coherent identity, not separating them, not rejecting them, but understanding how they all contributed to who she is now. Another key factor is autonomy, because one of the most powerful shifts in her journey is the move from being part of a family system defined externally to becoming an individual making decisions internally. Choices about relationships, choices about lifestyle, choices about personal boundaries, and each of those choices contributes to a stronger sense of self-definition. For Mykelti, this represents a shift from being observed to being self-directed. Another important concept is narrative ownership, because while the public may continue to interpret her story through the lens of television history, she has the ability to define her own present, to speak in her own voice, to shape her own identity outside of older narratives, and that ownership is a key part of psychological independence. Another layer is emotional continuity, because even as identity evolves, past experiences remain part of the emotional foundation. They do not disappear. They become integrated into memory, understanding, and perspective. For Mykelti Brown, this means her childhood within Sister Wives continues to be part of her story, but not the only part. Another psychological concept is resilience through visibility, because growing up in the public eye requires adapting to external interpretation from an early age, learning that people will form opinions, that stories will be edited, that perception will not always match reality, and developing resilience in that environment becomes a lifelong skill. Another important idea is perspective maturity, because as people grow older, they begin to reinterpret their past with more nuance, less simplicity, more understanding of complexity, and that shift allows for emotional balance between past and present identity. For Mykelti, this likely means her understanding of her upbringing has deepened over time, becoming more layered, more reflective, more grounded in adult perspective. And finally, the most important takeaway from her story is that identity is not something that is given, it is something that is built through experience, built through relationships, built through reflection, and built through the ongoing process of choosing who you want to become. For Mykelti Brown, her journey shows that even in the most visible and complex environments, personal identity can still take shape. It can still grow. It can still become independent of the system it began in. Because in the end, this story is not just about a family on television. It is about a person learning how to define herself beyond it. And that is where the real story begins, and where it continues to evolve.